We're going to do really a whirlwind tour of the history of the census, of why we do it, why it's important, what you may want to ask about, what its controversies are, its technology, and I hope I can do all that in 45 minutes. So we'll see. And I'll stop periodically to ask if I'm losing you and so forth. Okay, so let me push my little buttons here. Aha, whoops, that's sensitive. So as Bob said, I'm an historian. I've written a lot about census taking. This is the book that he was referring to, which is the second edition, came out in 2015. It's a kind of overview from the 18th century to the present. The other two are, the one on the right, which is hard to see, is a more in-depth book on the undercount controversies. The middle one is an encyclopedia that I did with two other census junkies, Connie Citro and Joe Salvo. There's other stuff, but that'll get you, that's plenty to start with. Okay, so why are we doing this? First, where, why, how, and the census was created in the Constitution to apportion seats in the House. And that's, its obvious function. But the second function is that the demographic history of the U.S. has made the census probably more important to this society than it would be to many other societies. And so it's the interconnection of those two things, the dynamism, the diversity, and then the constitutional requirements that make the census a very big deal every 10 years. Okay, so again, we've done it regularly, and this is running backwards, 50, 40, 30, then I jumped to 1870, this is right after the Civil War, 1850, that you should see a certain measure of continuity here, and then 1790, this is I don't have pictures for the first few censuses. This is a picture with the census results engraved on it, which is in the Smithsonian, right? So one of the other things that you'll discover is that there is an artifactual culture of census taking, which I can talk about as well. You'll see some of it here. Okay, why? The population of the U.S. grows. Right? And you'll see the other countries in a minute. We're used to that growth and don't really think of it as very important or abnormal. It is. The census is the one that captures that. It's a rare, repeated, unobtrusive event. Okay, so we're only going to be taking the 24th in 220 years, right? I like census people and demographers and statisticians count. So we've had 45 presidents, 58 presidential elections, 116 Congresses, but this will only be the 24th census. It's rare. It's repeated. We've done it every year like clockwork since 1790. That itself is important. Many societies have not done that, and it's an important piece, the fact that during the Civil War, economic crises, other political turmoil, the census has still continued and goes on. And we expect that. We can complain about its burdensomeness, but the point is we just do it routinely. And it's what is called unobtrusive or almost invisible. And this is an issue for you folks as journalists because it's so rare, most people don't remember the last one, the one before that, or the one before that. And I usually start these talks by saying, where were you on April 1st, 2010? And I get blank stares, right? And then I say, where were you on September 11th, 2001? And everybody knows, right? And it's the difference between the fact that it is supposed to be an unobtrusive event, that we count the population, and it is not supposed to burden the responding public so that you don't remember. Lots of people tell me when I give this talk that they never filled out a census form. Nah, I'm not in it. And of course, that's a complicated question because it may be that somebody else in the household filled it out for them, or they just don't remember, right, if you will. So it's an interesting phenomenon, which again, the media community always essentially deals with, and as well as the media and the Census Bureau at this time in the decade, reminding people about it. Okay, it's also Janus-faced, right, which means that we look forward and backward. And we do that in terms of not only the questions and the methods, in other words, well, how did we do it the last time? The results, we're always comparing the patterning, and you'll see a lot of that here, the growth rates, and so forth, how does it change? And then in the reapportionment and redistricting, so that we will watch political power shift because of the reapportionment and redistricting changes, and I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, so where'd it come from? Why did we do it? It's written into the 1787 Constitution, so that's in Philadelphia, and you've got a bunch of men in a room in the summer who come up with a document that says, we, the people of the United States, right, create this government. And so this notion that the people are the foundation of the state and sovereignty and political authority is at the root of the American political system. And even in the 18th century, there were certain problems with that, in particular, and I'm just going to show you some of the old guys that did this. Right, right. I always love that color picture because what you've got is they were working in the summer in Philadelphia in a closed room, right? Because this was all confidential negotiations. What the problems in terms of, from our perspective, that we're interested in here is they knew even then that the colonies, which had been separate units dealing with the British Crown during the colonial era, were going to have to unite somehow. And they had united in terms of fighting the war and winning it, but already by the 1780s, the government, if you will, was beginning to collapse in various ways. Why? Well, there were big states and small states. There were states with slavery, and there were states without slavery. There were maritime states, there were agricultural states. What do we do about the western lands, right? So all of these things came up in the Constitution, and the solution that they came up with was to write this paragraph that basically said, and you'll notice it it says both representatives and direct taxes. So they link political representation on the one hand, in other words, power, and on the other, responsibility, taxing, to account of the population by state. The power shall be apportioned among the states, which may be included in this union, in other words, there were going to be new states, according to their respective numbers. And then we go on to the niggling of what that means. And of course, it's in this detail that you begin to see the structure of a lot of the political issues that have been part of American history ever since. Namely, that we separate free from slave, right? We decide that what the form of labor in the 18th century called indentured servitude was part of the free population, and we take the Indians, who at that point were considered sovereign nations, out of the process altogether. Right? So this is the negotiations that take place at the time. If you read the Federalist Papers defending this document, they knew at the time that this was, that there were all kinds of problems with this, which of course happens later. But they needed a compromise. They needed some way to get the government going, and this was one of the major solutions in the Constitution. They also say, how are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? First of all, they say we're going to do it periodically, every 10 years, right? They also say we don't trust the states to count their own populations because they're likely to phony it up, right? So it's going to have to be a federal government function, which at the time was a real stretch because the federal government did extremely little in, well into the 19th century. There was no postal service. There were the only local officials that it turned out who could actually implement this turned out to be the assistants to the United States Marshals. Right? So it was a real difficulty, but they said this is really important, so it's a federal government function. So every 10 years, in such manner as they shall by law direct, meaning Congress. So Congress then had to write an implementing statute, which then will get amended and changed almost every decade since, in order to deal with the changes in the society. Okay. All right. So here's, as I said, the importance. The first nation in the world to do this, to count the population. Other countries were beginning to count, but they weren't necessarily tying it to their political systems because they weren't republics or democracies yet. And the, the combination of the two, of the demographic dynamism makes this enterprise central to the functioning of the state because it's a profoundly important balancing mechanism, as I think we'll be able to see. Okay. Yeah, okay. So population growth and change. Diversity, I'm just going to talk about numerical, geographic, and racial and ethnic right now, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical changes in the census. Have I got you so far? All right, we got a foundation of where this is coming from and why we're doing it. It's a profoundly political enterprise. Okay, numerical growth. All right, 3.9 million to 330 billion people, all right? 13 states are now 50. The House was originally 65 members. It's now 435. The average congressional district after the 2010 census was larger than the total population of any of the original 13 states in 1790. So the United States grew from a relatively small society to a very large society, and the census was a way that moved power every decade on the basis of it. Growth is differential, and this is where the rub comes in. Some states and local areas lose and others gain because the patterns are not uniform across the country. Okay, so, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to visualize some of this. The Census Bureau, or the Census Office in the 19th century, and then the Census Bureau in the 20th and later, understood this. You know, anybody who ran the enterprise, the administration, the administrative apparatus understood this. And what they did, so the Census Bureau is actually a pioneer in the visualization of data, right? It goes back into the 19th century. And what you can sort of see here, that looks like a light map. It's not. It's a demographic map of showing where people live. The light map would be very similar, but, right? Now I'm going to add the other countries, right? And so you can see Britain and France, which were considerably larger than the US in the 18th and early 19th century. Essentially, their populations grow very slowly. So in Europe today, most of the, you can take a census and you can shift seats around in the French National Legislature or the British Parliament. It's not going to, on the basis of population, it's not going to be mind-shattering changes. For us, given that swoop up, it is, right? And it means it's a great, it means a great deal. Even Japan, which I added in here, which is now stabilized and has some population decline, is much slower. Now, of course, Japan is an island about the size of Great Britain, so almost twice the size. Okay, so again, more visualization. This is on the left, we have the admission of states to the Union, and on the right, the growth in the size of the House of Representatives. You'll notice that both of them are kind of lumpy graphs. There's a nice you can draw a regression line through both of those, but you're going to miss a lot. You're going to miss data points, as statisticians would say. And I can talk about that, and maybe some of it will come up over the decade, particularly in the 20th century, why that 435 seats flatlined. That is not in the Constitution. The Congress could tomorrow decide to increase or decrease the size of the House of Representatives, and hence the Electoral College. It's a simple statutory change, which was made routinely for the first 130 years of the country, and then stopped. Okay, now I'm going to show you the diversity maps. You'll see these, and the Bureau, again, it does beautiful jobs at this stuff. I have some of them in 2010 and so forth. You can see the density here. You can also see growth and change. The purple here is population decline, which by definition means that the political power is going to shift out of those purple areas and into those green areas every decade. I have my own state of Wisconsin here, just to, as a slide I use. The Bureau publishes, drills down and gives you this visualization of data by state and local area and so forth. And again, you can see the pattern. There's always these color density contrasts, which are, which are quite striking. Okay, now this one I always love because I'm using this as an example of population growth and yet the loss of political power. So this is New York, right? Needless to say, when almost every local area, and as people come in to watch the census coming forward, if they think their population has grown, they think they deserve another member of Congress or another member, or, there should be more people in their state, we should get more in our state legislature. That's not the way it works. And in the New York case, it's particularly sharp because what happened is it grows tremendously in the early 19th century. Then the western part of the U.S. grows faster. New York's delegation decline. New York then urbanizes radically. It goes back up again. Then the West and the South grow again, and it goes back down. Right? So to understand these patterns, we will, will be one of the things that will be on the agenda over the next year or so. Anyway, the red states here are the ones that are going to gain seats. I mean, apportionment is a fairly crude process by state. It's only 50 states and 435 seats. So we know pretty much who's going to get what. I mean, there'll be some niggling over the last couple seats, the 434th and the 435th seats. But this pattern is pretty clear. And if essentially the areas that have been getting seats recently will continue to get them. The point of this is that there's two different maps here. One of them, and the political scientists fiddle with these numbers more than I do on this stuff. One of them is the map based apportionment based on population. The other one is apportionment based on voting age population. And in other words, it dings a state like Texas that has a lot of young people. Right? And we can argue, and one of the things that will come up in the debates about the census is how you translate people to political power. Is it, yeah? Are
those eligible to vote, like those are citizens?
Excuse me?
Are those eligible to vote? It's not just people that are voting.
No, it's voting age.
It's just voting age.
Voting age. It's just raw demography. Okay. Yeah. No, and the website that I pulled these from also has them by citizen, voter, actual voters. I mean, so you can drill down layer upon layer, and the political seats, seats will shift depending on which, notion of the people we use here. Okay, now, geographic diversity, obviously, this is the classic American history marching across the continent, and this is just a map of the the Americans, the cessions to the United States. The dark green is the original country, then the Louisiana Purchase, and then the yellow is after the Mexican War and the Oregon territories and so forth. The little red dots, and then Florida down on the left, which we took from Spain in the 1820s. The little red dots, which I'll show again, are the Census Bureau's conceptualization of how to understand the overall trajectory of the population. It's called the center of population. If you took every American of equal weight and made them stand on that map, the red dot is where the thing would balance for each decade, right? It's a mathematical concept. Here it is a little more blown up, right? And every decade, the Census Bureau publishes this. They publish centers of population for subgroups as well. So you can sort of, to visualize the change. But basically, it's a southwestern direction, right, over time. Okay, and of course, you're all going to end up talking about gerrymandering. And my main message here is that gerrymandering is a really old mechanism to deal with the results of the census in terms of its political implications. So the first gerrymander was in 1812, named after Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And this cartoon ended up in a newspaper, essentially mocking the fact that he had manipulated the drawing of the maps for the benefit of his political faction, if you will. And that, of course, has continued down to the present. We have never, as a country, quite figured out what to do about this, and there are lots of court cases sitting in the Supreme Court and in federal courts all over the country. So so you're going to hear more about it. But it's an old procedure of figuring out how to, once you get the apportionment done, how you use a map to again tweak the political system so that your guys, whoever your guys are or gals, does better. Okay, racial and ethnic diversity. Bureau showing the fact that Americans live in different places by race and ethnicity. Obviously, the African American population is still concentrated in the South, historically in the South. This is the Hispanics in the Southwest, right? No, this is non-Hispanic, white alone or in combination. Asian or in combination, again, mostly in the West. Hispanic white in combination, right? And so we can look at these, maps over and over again to see the patterning. Right. This is as a percentage of county population. There's various ways of thinking about this. And this is the foreign-born population. Right. The importance here is to see that, again, the dynamism and diversity is differential around the country, and as I said, the Bureau's efforts to explain these situations in ways that are more easily understood than giving you a table full of numbers gives you some of this stuff. Now, okay, anybody, you okay with that so far? All right. The other thing I want to do now is talk about how you do it, technical change. Now, I'm going to just give you a real brief overview here. You're going to get the nuts and bolts tomorrow. And then I'm going to do a little bit about 2020. But the important thing here is that the U.S. has, because of that constitutional grounding, there's a certain continuity here. You'll notice those three pictures. That's the 1850, 1870, and 1930. All show a family in the home or in the front door with a census taker on the one hand. At this point, they're all men. They soon become women, and as well, we begin to have women census takers. But arrayed around are then the members of the family, right? We now do the census either by mail, and of course in this round we're going to try to do a major internet census, but this basic continuity of going to the household, asking how many people there are and a little bit about their characteristics is, is continuous since 1790. So counting has always been done by household. Right, so we don't actually contact each person, we contact an address list of all the households in the United States. And then the tabulation and publication have always been done by the federal government in Washington, right? So what changes? The questions, right? We started out with 5 or 6 questions in 1790. The census ballooned in the 19th century into dozens of questions. Sometimes the census takers were carrying 6 or 7 different forms for various things. We added an agriculture census and a manufacturing census and a mortality census. And then we sort of, in the 20th century, sort of shrunk that back with the invention of probability sampling and kept the decennial as the core 10-year data collection, but have now shrunk down what goes on that to the phrase, the slogan in 2010 was 10 questions in 10 minutes, right? So there's been so the American Community Survey, which captures all the detailed characteristics of the population, is in the field all the time, right? But is not, but is as part of the decennial program, but is not going to be, there's no more what used to be called the long form. Right, it used to take the census to, obviously in the 18th century you walked and, rode on horseback. So it took years. Now it's down to a couple of months. We do it pretty quickly. The responses were done by hand on paper until 1880, then by mechanical tabulation, and I'll show you that in a minute, until 1950, and then by computer since then. Now, one of the interesting things is to realize the incredibly important role that the census plays in the development of our digital world. I mean, it was the census that invented what was called the machine tabulation, which became IBM, right? Why? Think of what it was like in 1880 when the American population was 50 million and you had to count it 1, 2, 3, 4, hash mark, 1, 2, 3, 4, hash mark, and that's right. And so the pressure to count this rapidly growing population and get the numbers to Congress so that you could reapportion the House meant that there was that it actually prompted technical innovation in census taking, right? And okay, so here we have some of the images of that. You can get a lot more of these beautiful shots of all this on the Census Bureau website. This one, this is a shot of just a room of key punchers, mostly women, but captures the scale of this enterprise. Right? It's, when it's in full development, there's a lot of people working on it. If you visit the Census Bureau headquarters out in Suitland, I think Bob and John can tell me better. I think that building holds 5,000 people, roughly. Yeah. Yeah, and then of course there are other Census Bureau facilities around the country. So there's a lot of people. This is a big operation. This is Univac for the 1950 census. You'll notice how clean and simple it all looks, right, at the time, right? That as we begin to mechanize a lot of these functions. I love this, right? This is the old-fashioned way of mapping, right? Believe it or not, until the 1970s, the census redid the maps every single decade, right? And we're working with paper maps, right? And this is 1960. Now, of course, we have a digital map, right, which is called Tiger Math. The topologically integrated geographic encoding and referencing system, which was a project of the 1980s, basically rolled out for the 1990 census, and the master address file, which is a digital map of ideally, or every residential address in the country, underpins the mechanism that we use to take the census, right? And so you can, this, you know, every time your UPS or Amazon guy shows up, you know, thank them for this, right? Right? Because this is federal government infrastructure. Okay, 2020, where are we? All right. A few years ago, this is what I thought was going to be the hot stuff, right? Paper or smart device. Well, we know we're going to do the smart device. I'm going to let the experts talk about exactly how that is going to work. What I've got here is the 2010 form and the way it used to look, and we'll see how it goes in 2020. But so we're going to try to shift, as other nations have, toward a digital platform to count. How much will it cost, right? The census has gotten very expensive over the last half century, and Congress has not been happy, and the Bureau has been under a lot of pressure in the last 30, 40 years to do it not only more accurately, but cheaper. And I'm sure that's going to continue. Will Congress or the President have different ideas? Obviously, I think that's the case. We had unified government until last November. Now we have a Democratic House, and of course the House of Representatives has always been the place that pays attention to the census, because it's their districts that are going to get moved around as a result of it. So I expect more oversight and interviewing and so forth, and hearings to come on this. I think Secretary Ross is supposed to go before one of the committees within, in a week or two. Will Americans respond? One of the interesting things is that some countries have had trouble taking censuses. People just won't answer them. Americans have been, by and large, pretty willing to answer their census. And in fact, the biggest complaint is, you missed me. Right? You haven't gotten all, so we've undercounted people. So there's a sense of the importance of sort of standing up and being counted, and will that continue on? What will be the reapportionment and redistrict implications? Again, we can talk about that. And then, of course, now we have some really big new issues on the agenda, in particular the controversy over Secretary Ross's mandate to put a question on citizenship on the decennial census, right? And ask it of the entire population. I'll make a bold statement here. Despite what he says about it being not, that we've done it in the past, there has never been a question asked on citizenship of the entire American population. Never. It was asked of the foreign-born for many, many years, but it has never been on the decennial census. And so, needless to say, it generated a lot of both technical criticism and concern, which has led to, as well as what we're going to hear about, stakeholder concern, and has led to litigation around the country. The trial, the case that went, the first case out of the box, which was in New York, is already to the Supreme Court to be heard this April, I think, because the census needs a clear answer. The court in New York enjoined the question. The court needs to decide whether the Census Bureau should print paper forms and other materials with or without the question. Right? So that's going to heat up if it has, as it has for the next couple months, and maybe after that. Litigation, there's always a lot of litigation in the last, say, 30, 40 years. Obviously, citizenship issues are the biggest ones, but there are other ones floating around having to do with the uses of the data, apportionment, redistricting, and so forth. And then finally, accuracy. Is the census going to be accurate? We always once we do it, have questions about did it work. And you'll hear from John Thompson tomorrow about that in detail. But what it boils down to is, remember that slide in New York, right, about how New York's losing its political representation. Any area of the country that thinks that it has been shortchanged is going to be very interested in that question and will start, asking hard questions about did we do it right. And we can talk more about that. Okay. All right. Now, so the controversies that have surrounded the census in the last couple hundred years have to do with the issues that are inherent in the enterprise. The undercount controversies were very important for about 40 years, 30, 40 years, in 1970 to 2000, sort of cooled. Most people don't know that in 1920, Congress got the census results and couldn't reapportion. And so there was no reapportionment of the House of Representatives and the Electoral College between 1911 and 1932, right? Needless to say, places that missed out on their representation were very upset, and we can talk about what that did. There are issues about confidentiality and whether the data that we collect is ever used to harm anybody. And there's a long development of the process over the of the 100 years from making census results public, which was the case in the 19th century, to saying, no, they should, they should be, the data we give to the government should only be open to the person who gave it, for the census, or and of course the genealogist says, but what about me? And so 72 years after we take the census, we open up the results and give it to the National Archives, and you can go look up your relatives, right? So the last census, the original census that is open is 1940. In 2022, the 1950 census original schedules will go to the National Archives and be opened. There are also cases, I'm using this as a issue of accuracy, there are also cases of frauds. There's a famous case in 1910 in Tacoma, Washington, where local officials, not the federal officials, added 30% of people. They just made up all sorts of people and put it on the forms and got caught and prosecuted for doing that, right? Very rare, but it does happen every so often, right? We will, the census is an important popular phenomenon. There will be cartoons. You saw some of them here, in paintings, comedy routines. There's a classic from 2010 with Betty White and Tina Fey on Saturday Night Live. I'd show it to you, except I always have, copyright and problems with doing it. But basically, Tina Fey is the interviewer, and Betty White is the respondent who's not quite sure what's going on, right, and so forth. It's a wonderful 4-minute routine. The maps in the media, have you seen some of them? And then there are the artifacts like that picture that I showed you. There are many. There will be T-shirts. There will be pens. There will be banners put up in local areas. So there will be a rich sort of cultural expression of all of this as well. Right. So that's, I think I'm running out of my time, and so we can, this will get us started for the days ahead. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tara Barhampour with the Washington Post. We've talked before. So pretty much across the board, whenever I talk with people about the citizenship questions history, everyone says it was asked until 1950, and then it was only asked on the long form or the ACS. So can you explain, when you're saying that was never ever asked, what does that mean?
This has been, we've slipped on this one. It was never asked of the total population. In other words, the way that the question worked until, through 1980 was that you asked, most prominently from about 1890 to 1980, was you asked where your place of birth was. Where were you born? right? And if you were born in the US, you wrote your state down. And if you were born outside the country, you wrote the country down. And then if you were asked, and then if you were born outside the country, then you got asked, are you a citizen? Or have you, are you still, have you tried to take out naturalization papers? Right? So the question never was asked of the, of the American-born citizen population until 1990 in the sample, the long-form sample. And that was because in 1980, when we had gone to the male census, in 70 we began it, and 80 about 90% of the population got a household form in the mail. People made a mistake. They confused being a natural-born citizen with a naturalized citizen. So, right, because that was the way it said on the form. So a lot of people who were born in, New Jersey basically said, yeah, I'm a naturalized citizen. And the Census Bureau had to go in and do a computer edit saying, no, you misunderstood the question. So in the 80s, they said, well, how are we going to fix this, right? So what they test, of course, they test everything, right, in the Census Bureau. And they realized, so they tested it in such a way that said, look, we'll just ask, are you a citizen? And then in parentheses, born in the United States. Ah, yeah, that's me. I was born in the United States. I'm a I'm a naturalized citizen. Yeah. Because the word naturalized citizen doesn't make sense to native-born Americans. That's what I mean by saying it was never asked in the full count. If we put it on the decennial, as we're doing, as proposed, it will go to everyone. So you'll get a record of every single person, whether they were born, because there is no question on proposed to saying where were you born. Yeah.
Okay, mine is more of a comment than a question, actually. I'm Tom Gitter from Charlie, it's the African Community newspaper in Minneapolis. I always find, I've been in this country and we've gone through about two censuses, the 2000 and the 2010. And as from my experience, we find that the American Community Survey tends to address the undercounting of the foreign-born population, especially out in our state in Minnesota. So we had some issues with the census, especially the 2000, where we felt a lot of the African immigrants over there were undercounted. But for the last 20 years, we're coming to 2010, and we feel that the community survey has gotten much better in capturing the numbers of actually what the actual number of African immigrants, for example, is in Minnesota, which are the Somalis, Ethiopians, Kenyans, and so forth.
Again, don't forget, in order to capture immigrants, you have to ask, where were you born? That's a different question from asking whether you're a citizen, right? Because an alien can be from any part of the world, right? So that what you're talking about is that the place of birth question is identifying African immigrants. Place of birth is an easier question for people to understand. Yeah, we sort of know where we were born. Yeah.
Yes, Khalil Abdullah, Ethnic Media Services. Just curious about the Civil War. You said it was counted. The census continued during the Civil War. How did that actually work during the Civil War?
During what?
The Civil War.
The census was taken before the Civil War started. The census was taken in the spring of 1860. Right? The war started in April of 1861. So the census results were all collected and reported. And in fact, I have a chapter in here on this because it was one of the, when the southern slave states saw the results, because the population growth was in the northern free states, north and western free states, it was one of the things that pushed them towards secession, in addition to Abraham Lincoln getting elected. But there was a famous abolitionist who said the laws of population are themselves abolitionists because the free population in the United States grew much more rapidly in the antebellum period than the slave state population did. Yeah.
But if I might, how does that square with your comment about the length of time it took to actually do the census? So you're saying they did it in 1 year?
Yes, they did in the by 1860 they had narrowed it down to, basically a year.
Margo, can you say more about 1920 and how the House refused to reapportion itself?
yeah.
And how did they get away with it and so on?
Yeah, can you push up that slide on the one on the visuals? I want to show you an image of this. It's on the end of that. There's another. I have some other PowerPoint images. Yeah, these are. There are some wonderful images here of enumerators, and we can talk about this. This is. Right, let me see. That's this one is the one on 1920. Okay, and this affects us now because this affects us now. What the 1920 census showed was for the first time in the history of the settlement of the area that became the United States is that the rural areas were no longer dominant. The urban areas were more than 50%, and that in a country, especially one that's steeped in Jeffersonian political traditions, freaked some people out, including people in rural areas that saw their political power waning away. The result was that there was, and this is not a partisan issue because it was, in the 1920s, there was unified Republican control of all three branches, of both houses of Congress and the presidency. But the rural parts of the country and the representatives refused to pass an apportionment bill for 9 years. And what part of the claim was that one of the mechanisms that they'd used up until that point, which was to increase the House size. So, okay, all right, so you're going to lose relative political representation. Well, yeah, but we'll just add more seats in those areas that are growing, right? And that's the image on the right, which is they're saying, oh, we can't do this anymore. The House of Representatives is too crowded. There's no place for, we don't have enough room for people. So the effect of it was in 1929 to pass the mechanism that we now use, which was to say the Congress basically said, look, the Secretary of Commerce is simply going to report the apportionment results, and unless Congress overrides it, in other words, unless they come in and pass an affirmative statute, it will automatically go into effect after the next census, and that's what we've been living with ever since. You realize that we were beginning to have an emerging constitutional crisis in 1928 because the Electoral College that year was still based on the 1910 apportionment, right? So that was the solution. What they did, unfortunately, and I can talk in more detail, is that they also took out of the law what the language about compact, contiguous, and equally sized districts. So a lot of states they didn't reapportion to the urban areas for another 40 years until the Supreme Court stopped those shenanigans with the one-man, one-vote decisions. It's complicated. Yep, enough. Yeah.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah, then we got to go. Yeah.
So following up on that, how did they get away with ignoring the Constitution for 10 years?
How did they get away? Now, I think that's a bigger question than I can answer. They just.
Were there no lawsuits
No. Actually, the process, it's a more. There's again another chapter in here on that. It's a more complicated story than the one I've just laid out. But no, there were no lawsuits. Congress was equally foolish or hopeful, thinking, well, we'll just make the next Congress do it, And they had bills in the hopper for 6 Congresses. They just couldn't get them through the body. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, thanks.